You've been so nice. I just want to thank you again.
You're welcome.
So why don't we get what is that you have there? What is that?
It's it's Excalibur. It was given to me by the Lady of the Lake to signify that I was to be the King of the Jews.
Is that a joke?
No, it's real. She's the Lady of the Lake. She extended Excalibur through the waters, and she said, by this mighty sword will you rule the Jews.
I just watched a KABC report on you, and it reminded me of something. Do you still use that weird sideways keyboard?
No, I don't. I do a lot of other weird things, like my Excalibur here, but I no longer use the vertical keyboard. But I'd be happy to go back with it. I really liked it.
Why did you use it, by the way?
I had problems with my elbows, some mild carpal tunnel. So it's a lot easier just ergonomically to type like this, with your hands to the side, typing on a sideways keyboard, than to turn your hands over so that they're horizontal above the keyboard.
So last time we left off, we were just getting into, I think we were in the mid-90s, and your entry into being a journalist focused on porn.
Yeah, starting in 1995.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I just wanted to finish up some questions I had about you and Judaism, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
So I've loved watching this interview you did with this girl named Sheila. I don't know who she is. I'd love to interview her. But I heard you say in it, you were talking about the idea of Jesus, and that you didn't like this idea that God would come back to earth in the form of a man and then kill his own son. Can you talk about what you think about Jesus? Who was he? Can you talk about that?
Sure. I'd phrase it this way, that Jesus just never spoke to me, even though he was the very center of my religion, and my religion, revolved around making Jesus divine, and Jesus was just the most awesome thing ever. I never really got into Jesus, so it wasn't that I consciously realized I disliked him, but he just never spoke to me. I was just never stirred that way. So I was much more interested in the Hebrew Bible than the New Testament, and it just didn't do it for me. Just like attraction's not a choice, so I was never attracted to Jesus. And then when I discovered Judaism, it was like a relief. It's like, oh yeah, the guy's a fraud, and it's like I have my Jewish friend who I could have called Sheila in that interview is very attracted to Christianity, and she's Jewish by birth, raised in conservative Judaism, and there are many wonderful things about Christianity, but come on, do you really believe that this guy walking around Nazareth 2,000 years ago is God, and that he died on a cross to save you for your sins, and that if you believe in him, you'll have eternal life, and that if you vicariously participate in eating his flesh and drinking his blood, that you will go to heaven, and that the next world is much more important than this world? I mean, that's just nonsense from a non-Christian perspective. It just seems like, totally ludicrous. It seems pagan. I mean, from a non-Christian perspective, Christianity looks like pure idolatry. And, certainly from a Jewish perspective, Christianity looks like idolatry. Now, we don't tend to rule that way in Jewish law because it would be inconvenient for us in doing business. And Christians would not take kindly to us calling them idolaters and referring to Christianity as idolatry. But just from a purely rational, factual basis, yeah, Christianity from a Jewish perspective seems, completely idolatrous. It seems drenched in paganism. It just seems, the whole story of Jesus dying on a cross to save the world for his sins just seems like the most ludicrous, repulsive, pagan story ever.
There's been a lot of messiahs in world history. The best. Oh, by the way, Luke. Just for sound, it's totally fine if you want to continue doing that with the hand, whatever that thing is. But if you could not do that, just for the sound, if you don't want to, that's fine. I just wanted to say that.
Okay.
Yeah. So the best argument for Jesus is that people are still talking about him 2,000 years later, and it seems like, oh, there must be something special about this one. I mean.
Yeah, that is a good argument. 2 billion people basically believe he's God, so that is an argument, and I'm sure there are lots of arguments for Jesus. I'm just saying from a Jewish perspective, it seems like idolatry, and it seems like foolishness, and it seems ludicrous. So, whatever the argument, from a Jewish perspective, we wouldn't even consider the arguments. Like, why would we care what Goyim think about some guy, who lived 2,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 2,500 years ago? If Goyim choose to worship somebody, the texts of Goyim have no religious significance for a Jew. So Jews don't look into the Quran and go, oh, maybe Muhammad is the greatest of the prophets. And Jews don't look into the Bhagavad Gita for religious truth. And Jews, certainly don't look at the New Testament and go, maybe they've got a point here. It's not like, we're rejecting these arguments. We don't even consider them. It's just so repugnant and repulsive from a Jewish perspective. We would never look at the book of Matthew and go, what is God trying to say here?
But some Jews, I'm forgetting his name. I think his name is Joseph Judd. He wrote a biography of William F. Buckley. I'm looking it up right now. He wrote a book called The Archbishop of Conservatism. He, for instance, wrote a book about Jesus, and he considers Jesus the last great Jewish teacher or mystic. So some people, because he was a Jew, think that there were some value in what he said, unlike Muhammad.
Well, when a Jew has 2 billion followers, like any, sane Jew with an intellectual bent or a proclivity for shaping sentences is going to go, oh, there's a market here. A Jew looks at Jesus. How can you go wrong from an economic perspective? And if you live in the West is primarily shaped by Christianity. So there's just every incentive, for the non-Orthodox Jew who wants to be a public intellectual or who wants to sell some books or, be edgy or whatever to engage with Jesus. But just from a traditional Jewish perspective, there's just no reason to engage with Jesus.
I presume you've done some reading on Jesus. Tell me, because I'm generally curious, what type of guy, if you encountered this guy, what kind of guy was this? Would he have been a hippie today? What would he have thought about Kim Kardashian? Yeah, it's a crazy question, but what kind of guy? Because now he sort of comes off as a PC liberal, but who do you think he actually was?
I think he was a guy very much like Dennis Prager. He's like, thousands of Jews who've, developed this following. They just have this guru status, and they just gain followers, and they tell them how to lead their lives. And usually this advice doesn't work so well for people who follow it, but it's really good for the guru. And, I think Jesus was a Jew like, tens of thousands of Jews in, developing a religious following. I think he was a Jewish nationalist. I think that he was probably a Pharisee. I think he probably would be absolutely appalled to realize that there are 2 billion Gentiles that think he's God. I don't think Jesus ever had any idea that he was God. The idea of believing that one is the Messiah is a very common Jewish thing in history. That 2 billion Goyim regard Jesus as the Messiah. That's no big deal. It's that they view him as God that was really weird. And so I don't believe that Jesus ever regarded himself as part of a triune Godhead. I don't believe Jesus ever thought for a minute that he came to earth to save humanity from sin by dying on a cross. So I don't believe Jesus for a second believed in any of the unique Christian theological dogmas, including original sin. I think Jesus was a Jewish nationalist who was trying to cleanse Israel from the Romans, and that he was trying to lead this worldly rebellion. And then when it failed, his followers had all sorts of visions, and they, reimagined, Jesus in the light of Greek pagan eschatology. It reminds me very much of my upbringing as a Seventh-day Adventist, when Seventh-day Adventist Church was formed in the 1840s. On Yom Kippur, 1844, thousands of the followers of William Miller in America, basically followers largely out of Methodism, believed that Jesus was coming back, because that was 2,300 years since the cleansing of the sanctuary under Ezra the scribe. So they sold all their earthly goods and stood out in the field waiting for Jesus to come back, and it didn't happen. So they then tried to reinterpret it, and their reinterpretations were always assisted by the so-called visions of a prophetess named Ellen G. White, who'd been hit on the head at a very young age by a rock and developed epilepsy. And then she became very useful for the church, because whenever the church elders would decide on some development in their dogma, Ellen G. White would then subsequently have a vision which would confirm the divine approval or the divine nature of the church's development of dogma. So that's kind of also how I see the origins of Christianity.
What did you think of the Passion of the Christ?
It was like a snuff film. I did not enjoy it at all. I don't enjoy watching long torture scenes. That's just not what I'm into, and it completely left me cold.
I liked it. I thought it was a very scary movie, actually. But a lot of Jewish rabbis were upset with the movie because they say it implies that the Jews killed Jesus. What do you take issue with the idea that the Jews killed Jesus?
Yeah, because from a historical, factual basis, yeah, because Jews weren't in charge of Palestine at the time. That Jews have never hung people on a cross. It's a totally un-Jewish thing. It was the Romans who did that routinely. They did it to thousands of Jews. They hung them on crosses and killed them that way. It was a totally non-Jewish way of executing people. So, yeah, I believe that the Romans were 100% responsible for the killing of Jesus. So, yeah, that's my perspective. But in a sense, Jews, kill Jesus every generation in their unbelief. Jews kill Jesus by, denying that he's God. So I can understand from a Christian perspective why they regard Jews as killing Jesus.
I'm pretty ignorant on religion, but I hear that apparently the Jews chose a guy named Barabbas instead of this Jesus guy.
Yeah, I think I really like Chaim Maccabee. His books on first century Christianity. He wrote one book on Jesus, another book on the Apostle Paul. But I think he shows pretty convincingly that Barabbas is simply Jesus, but they split. And they split all the traits of Jesus that they don't want for their religious figurehead, and they just kind of pawn them off on Barabbas. But I think it seems fairly clear from Chaim Maccabee scholarship that Jesus and Barabbas were one and the same. But the fledgling church, trying to deal with the disappointment of Jesus being crucified and then having these visions that he was divine, played with the story so that Barabbas gets all of Jesus's unwanted traits. I mean, I think splitting is a pretty common psychological phenomenon, even that we see around us to this day.
Yeah, as I told you, I interviewed a very, I would say, extreme Catholic, E. Michael Jones, and he quoted to me that, Jesus said, the synagogue is Satan, and he said, and he put a lot of meaning into that. But you sort of think he was referring to what he saw as the corruption of Israel, and
I think that text comes from John, which was the last of the Gospels, and the least lifelike. Like Mark was the first gospel. It was written around year 70, and then followed by Matthew and Luke, and then John was written like around 100 to 110 of the Common Era. It was the last of the Gospels. It's totally unlifelike. It reads very much like a Greek. It reads very much like a piece of Greek literature. It's very Gnostic and mystical and just completely alien to the Jewish tradition. While Mark and Matthew are the kind of the closest of all the Gospels to the Jewish tradition. But I don't believe that the authors of any of the Gospels were Orthodox Jews. I'm not even sure that they were Jews because they have such a warped understanding of the Jewish religion. So John's the last of the Gospels. It's the least historical. There's like a Jesus seminar where scholars vote on which the sayings are authentic to Jesus, and I'm pretty sure that they would have voted that saying about the synagogue of Satan was not something that the historical Jesus ever said or would have thought about.
My last question about Christianity is, I've been long curious. I knew a evangelical Christian, and he kept telling me about how his cousins who were in the Air Force and evangelicals had adopted an African boy from like Sudan. And I thought that was a perfect illustration of modern American Christianity today. It's a Air Force family who adopts an African child and digs ditches in Kenya on vacation.
That's perfect. Yeah. That's great. I mean, Christianity used to be totally compatible with white rule in Europe and in America. And so until like the last 50 years, Christianity was totally compatible and even a bulwark of white rule in Christendom and in the United States. And but in the last 50 years, Christianity has been totally warped. And the universalist strand of Christianity has come to the fore. So yeah, all these Christians are adopting black babies and kind of giving away their white European heritage and losing all sense of themselves as a separate race with their own destiny and their own civilization that they've created. So I don't think necessarily that Christianity is an obstacle to a revival of the white race, but it's certainly its Christian elites and Christian churches have certainly gone downhill in this regard in the last 50 years, and they've contributed tremendously to the destruction of the West, pushing for more and more immigration, pushing for civil rights for blacks, for a colorblind society, for taking in Muslim refugees and adopting black babies, and this kind of just very sick, destructive universalist policies, many of which would be equally approved of by most Jewish organizations, which kind of push this multicultural agenda.
Well, that's what I was the rest of the question was, if you compare what it is today, which is, washing the third world's feet, basically, and then you compare it to the Christianity of the past, it seems very different. But my question is, has there the germ of the PC Christianity that exists today, this sort of fetishization of the outsider, of the weak, of the slave, has that always been there, or is this totally new?
I think there's strands that have always been there. Certainly having sympathy for the slave, for the downtrodden, for the weak is a sentiment that's in Christianity and in Judaism, and I'm sure a lot of other religions. I think Nietzsche is just a very profound thinker, saw Christianity and I think Judaism as well as both slave religions. But Christianity was the dominant force of Europe until the 20th century, and Europe was, a very strongly white, very fairly confident civilization. So I think many of the sick trends that have come to the front of Christianity in the last 70 years have been there all along, but in much more muted and in healthier forms. And so if you just play with percentages, everything comes down to percentages. So, for instance, there are strands in Judaism that stress humility. But if you know Jews, and if you know how Judaism operates, and if you know Christians and how Christianity operates, you know that humility gets much more stress in Christianity than it does in Judaism, and that Jews, generally speaking, are not known for their humility. You give a Protestant a compliment, and typically they'll say, "Oh no, not me." But if you give a Jew a compliment, typically he'll look for another one. He can keep going. There's no such thing as like too much aggrandizement, too much honor, too much money, too much power, too much sex, too much fame. Like one of God's promises to Abraham is that your name will be known around the world. And that's a very Jewish thing to want and to go after. Like Jews, love to let you know how awesome they are, which is kind of the opposite that it is with Protestantism. Now there are certainly strands in Judaism that promote humility. So everything is a matter of percentages. So something when it's at a 3% percentage may not be nearly as significant as when it moves to 30% or 60%. And so I think these unhealthy trends in Christianity were not unhealthy when they were at a very small level, but now they've exploded and they're destroying the Western world.
Do you think they're aware of this and self-conscious? How Christianity is now identified with adopting African kids. Do they seem at all aware of that sort of, what that looks like to certain people?
I think most white people have been so beaten down that it's bad to identify as white and to even consider for a moment that whites may have group interests. So I think it's just been beaten. They've just been beaten. And yet it keeps popping up with implicit white identity, in that almost everybody leads a segregated, racially and religiously segregated life as they can. Almost everybody chooses to live among their own kind. Almost everybody chooses to socialize among their own race. Almost everybody prefers to work among their own race. Almost everybody prefers to be educated among their own race. White people prefer to stay with white people and to worship with white people. Blacks prefer to worship with blacks. Koreans prefer to worship with Koreans. So pretty much everybody leads a segregated life. It's just that whites have been beaten down that they shouldn't think about white group identity.
I could make a devil's advocate argument that perhaps that's changing, but I think I want to get into the race a little bit later, but I'll just say this. I would say I think Kim Kardashian enjoys diversity. What about her?
Yeah, there are certainly, people who race mix, but, the evidence is overwhelming. 95% of people, prefer to live among their own race, to socialize among their own race, to worship among their own race, to work among their own race, and to get educated among their own race. So that's just a very strong statistical pattern.
Why do you think you like the Old Testament better than the New Testament?
It seems just much more profound. The New Testament just never spoke to me. this whole idea of like, God sending his son to earth to die on a cross so that, humanity could be forgiven for its sins and live forever in heaven. It just totally leaves me cold. It just seems ludicrous to me. So, the Hebrew Bible is just much easier to relate to. It's much more interesting. I think it's much more profound. It's much more about how, the world works, and, it reflects much more the quality of people that I've known in my life. I can see them mirrored in the pages of the Hebrew Bible.
You scoff at the idea of Jesus walking on water. What do you think about the idea that these, the first Hebrew prophets were talking to God and living to 800? Do you believe that?
Well, I never said I scoffed at the idea of Jesus walking on water. I scoffed at the idea of Jesus being part of a triune Godhead coming to earth to die on a cross to save people from their sins. I never mentioned, scoffing at the miracle stories. So every religion has miracle stories. So I just take that, that for granted. The story that Jesus walked on water, it doesn't, I don't have any reaction to it one way or another. And as far as like supernatural against nature parts of the Hebrew Bible, I don't know. I converted to Orthodox Judaism, so there are limits on how much skepticism I want to express publicly. I certainly try to understand everything within a natural way, such as the splitting of the Red Sea. Maybe it was the tide, or I have no interest in trying to debunk the Hebrew Bible and the miracle stories, and but I try to understand them in as a natural way as possible.
So let's go back to the 90s. So you're this guy with an Australian accent. You've been afflicted with this sickness that started during UCLA. You listen to Dennis Prager, and you've decided you want to become an Orthodox Jew. I really encourage you to write a screenplay about those early years, because I can imagine a lot of funny scenarios. Can you remember the first time you walked into a synagogue?
Oh, absolutely. It was on a Friday night. It was a Reformed temple in Citrus Heights. I think it was like 1992. And I was kind of shocked by how short Jews were, by how many were obese, how many of them seemed like their facial features seemed kind of deformed, or what I would later come to understand is the result of centuries living in the unhealthy ghettos. How unattractive most of them were. It was just like a kind of a physical shock going to synagogue, and kind of thinking the services were really lame, and oh my God, what am I getting myself into? But yeah, that was my first experience, and yeah, I have to say many of my early experiences with synagogue were kind of like, oh my God, this is so boring. How am I going to endure this? But I did make some human connections with people that I very quickly came to love. And there was a big social component to Judaism, which was very easy for me to embrace. I also enjoyed the classes where they would teach Torah, and there'd be a lot of learning. But prayer has always been very difficult for me.
So I'm just very curious. I would love to be a fly on the wall. When you walked in there, and did someone ask you, "Hey, who are you? Why are you here?"
No, I came with friends.
Oh, I see.
And so I'd already been studying and reading up on Judaism for about 3 years by this point. So I was pretty prepared intellectually, cognitively. So it was fine. I arranged to meet a woman there that I'd met through like a singles ad, and a non-Jewish woman, and she was kind of afraid to set foot, and so I had to go outside and find her. So yeah, it was an interesting Friday night.
But in those early years, did you have to like explain yourself? You know, were people questioning you? You know, was there any difficulty?
Oh yeah, there was quite a bit of difficulty. Jews don't really want converts to Judaism, and so I really had to push, and wasn't easy to convert to Judaism. So yeah, I had to do a lot of explaining. I obviously did not look Jewish, so it was an interesting journey. I remember at my first Beit Din for my Reform Judaism conversion. I remember saying, I love Judaism, but I do have a problem with Jews.
They must have loved hearing that. So how long did you stay in Reform synagogue?
Well, I was never focused on staying Reform. That was just the synagogue that was closest to me. So I was always interested in all strands of Judaism, from Reform to Conservative to Orthodox. So I participated in all three strands pretty much equally until the year 2000 and my trip to Israel. And then when I came back from then, I was pretty much exclusively Orthodox ever since.
So you talked about your first trip to a Reform synagogue, and I'm familiar with that. I'm not familiar with Orthodox Judaism, but I can imagine it must have been more intimidating the first time you went into an Orthodox synagogue. What was that different?
Yeah, that was much more intimidating, and I stepped in. I came to Los Angeles 2 days before the first Passover Seder. And so I walked to this Orthodox synagogue to try to find a place for the Seder. And the rabbi said, "Well, who did your conversion?" And I said the name of the Reform rabbi, but I deliberately kind of mumbled it because I knew I was in trouble. I didn't know that they would vet me this closely. And then the Orthodox rabbi wanted to call the rabbi who did my conversion. So I started reading out his phone number, and then I deliberately changed the last digit so that he wouldn't be able to get a hold of him. And yeah, that was awkward. And it took me several attempts to finally get through an Orthodox Jewish conversion through an Orthodox Jewish Beit Din. But from 1994 onward, I was in an Orthodox synagogue every few days for davening or for learning or for whatever. So from moving to Los Angeles and to the Pico Robertson neighborhood in 1994, from then on, I was thoroughly immersed in Orthodox Judaism.
And what were the differences you noticed between Reform and Orthodox?
Reform was much easier to deal with. It had much fewer restrictions. It was much more open and experimental and fun. They had, the women were sluttier, and there was, musical instruments on the Sabbath, and they had Israeli dancing, and it was just much more of an ethnic club. It was just kind of much more of a social thing. Conservative Judaism was a wonderful mixture for me for years between the restrictions of orthodoxy and the anything goes attitude of Reform. There's like a special camaraderie to conservative Judaism that I really enjoy. They didn't judge you and demand as much as orthodoxy, so it was more relaxed, and yet there were still standards. So you felt very much like you're in the club, if you simply showed up to a conservative synagogue. But once you just showed up at that club, you were in the club, and there was just this camaraderie that it was unique and special, and just very moving for me. Coming from foster care in my early years and seeking to find a home for myself with my own family in Australia. And then orthodoxy was the most intimidating. It had the biggest commitment. It was high intensity religion, had the most learning opportunities, and it had the most depth, and it was it began to exert more of a pull on me. I hadn't really intended to become Orthodox, but Orthodoxy just kept pulling me in, and then by year 2000, I just could not resist it anymore.
But let me ask it this way. At the time you were experimenting with all three, let's say that there was a sermon the Friday after the O.J. Simpson trial. What would a sermon have been in Reform versus Conservative versus Orthodox? What I'm trying to get at is, my impression is that Reform is much more about...
Yeah, I got your question already.
Yeah.
You don't have to go on. So, yeah, there were very clear patterns, which I picked up quickly. In an Orthodox sermon, any reference to anything outside of Orthodox Judaism was regarded as edgy. So if the rabbi talked about listening to the radio, like, we would just all crack up laughing. The thought of our rabbi, like, listening to the radio just, was hilarious. So in Reform Judaism, anything goes. So about 10% or so of the rabbis that I got to know in Reform Judaism did not even believe in God. They were atheists. So Reform Judaism was anything goes, and then Conservative was kind of right in between. So Orthodox Judaism, they would very rarely talk about, any Gentile matter such as, the O.J. Simpson trial, or, anything goyish was, just hilarious. If you heard anything referencing anything goyish from the bema, the pulpit, we would just all crack up laughing. And in Reform Judaism, it was like anything goes. And then Conservative was much more particularistic, is probably closer to Orthodox Judaism than to Reform, in that it didn't really have much to say about the Gentile world, and it had a particular focus on what's going on with Jews.
And did they make you prove yourself, like, to prove you really were sincere? Was there any moment like that?
Well, I was constantly getting myself into trouble because I had a big mouth, and I would just, I'd ask, I was just always arguing with people, asking really provocative questions, and, I was just constantly rubbing people the wrong way. I was coming from 6 years being bedridden, and suddenly now I'd, thrust myself into the furnace of Judaism, and, I didn't really know the mores, and I was just like diving in after kind of missing out on so much of life. So I was just on this kind of slaughterpalooza, where I was going to like so many different synagogues, so many different classes, so many different social events, sleeping with so many different women, meeting so many people, just tossing out so many opinions, asking so many provocative questions. I was like really over the top. I rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. A lot of people still hate me from, getting to know me 20 years ago. I can never forgive or forget how obnoxious I was. I was just over the top. The medication that helped me overcome my bedridden status is called Nardil, Nardil. And a lot of people, when they take it, they lose their inhibitions. And I'm not a very inhibited person to begin with. So I was just really over the top. Like many people who take it become shoplifters. And I was just like, I was just bouncing off the walls. I was just so aggressive and just, constantly hitting on women and, during Kiddush. And, I was vulgar and crude and aggressive and obnoxious and just, a real slut, just going to so many different synagogues and so many different social occasions and so many, learning occasions, and just sleeping with so many different women. I was just up in as much of Jews and Judaism as I could put myself.
Any flings with the Orthodox or conservatives, with girls?
I didn't have any flings with those who are Orthodox from birth. But, a lot of people go to Orthodox synagogues who are either newly Orthodox or they're just, putting one foot in. They're just experimenting. And so those type of people tend to not just be experimental with their synagogue choices, but to be experimental in the bedroom as well.
So, by the way, are you Lubavitch?
I don't belong to any particular sect of Orthodox Judaism. I enjoy it all. So I enjoy modern Orthodoxy. I enjoy Lubavitch. I enjoy Lithuanian yeshivish Orthodoxy. It's all wonderful to me.
And when did you learn Hebrew?
Oh, I started picking it up in 1993, 1994, but no, it's not that great. But I can read the Siddur, and I can often kind of figure out some words and phrases of the Talmud and of the Torah.
Some relatives of mine are trying to get me to go to a Lubavitch meeting. Do you think it's a bad idea?
I don't know. You may hate it, but would that be bad if you just check it out? Anyway, it's called Lubavitch. I've never heard of anyone calling it Lubavitch.
Yes.
So, yeah, why not get up in there and see if you like it, or see if you like some of the people. I'll tell you a funny story. The porn industry is dominated by Jews, and I was sitting on a porn set talking to Nina Hartley, the Jewish porn star, and she starred in the porn movie Debbie Does Dishes, which is kind of about Jewish women. And she was talking about she and her husband, Ira Levine, had a Shabbat dinner in Denver with a Chabad rabbi. And the Chabad rabbi challenged Ira, says, why aren't you an Orthodox Jew? And Ira said, well, I'm into S&M. And the rabbi sat there for a minute, stroking his beard, and then finally he says, well, S&M is not forbidden.
Is Nina Hartley? She's not Orthodox.
No porn stars are Orthodox. So
Yes.
some of the businessmen, may affiliate Orthodox, but they go from being, a secular schmuck to being, an Orthodox schmuck. It's just, it's more kind of a superficial affiliation thing.
See, I think an anti-Semite, or people have problems with that term, an anti-Jewish person would seize on this example of a porn producer being Orthodox Jew, and they would say, oh, this shows everything I thought about Jews, that it's a gutter religion, but how do you view that? Is that kosher in Judaism for an Orthodox Jew to make money in the porn industry?
No, it's not kosher in any religion, whichever way to make money from the porn industry or to work in the porn industry. But Judaism does have a more easygoing attitude towards the natural passions, whether they're passions for porn or sex, money, power, fame, and the like, than pretty much any other religion. Has a kind of a more realistic attitude to human nature, and so do Jews. So even though you're supposed to elevate these desires and channel them in a good direction, that people are lustful and power hungry and sex hungry and want fame and honor and fortune. Jews talk in a much more relaxed manner about sex, money, power, and fame than do Gentiles, and Jews and Judaism tend to have a much more relaxed attitude towards these natural passions.
That's one thing I've observed is there's a Jewish honesty about subjects like sex that is striking. And do you have any idea why that is? Is it from the debate and the openness that the culture of Talmud, that the Talmud encouraged?
I think it's there from the beginning. So if you look at the Torah, it's a pretty down to basics text. So I would assume that it's also a product of the genetics, and also the genetics plus environment plus culture. So I think the answer for it would be to be found in the genetics, in the environment in which Jews developed, the Middle East, Israel, and in the culture, in the sacred texts and the culture that Jews have developed.
Now that leads into something I wanted to ask you about, which is a book called The 13th Tribe by Arthur Koestler. This is a very big thing on YouTube, which is this Khazar theory. And I guess it just says that Jews aren't Semitic. They're not, I guess it says they're not even the Jews mentioned in the Bible. They're from like the Ukraine, and they just adopted the religion.
Yeah, I think it's absolute nonsense. No scholar, holds by the Khazar theory. I mean, even Kevin McDonald says, it's just absolute nonsense.
Yeah, I just talked to a guy who holds to it, and he says John Hopkins proved that the Jews in Israel aren't even from there. And how would you respond to that?
Well, I would just be glad that anyone who believes such nonsense is not someone I'd want in my life, or that I would even bother talking to. It'd just be like, see you later. The person's just a blithering idiot, and it's just such a great. When you get these tip-offs that someone's an absolute idiot, it just economizes. It just saves you time and effort. There's just no reason to have any dialogue with them. And the same thing with like those people who deny that there are ever gas chambers. They're an idiot. The more sophisticated, Holocaust revisionists, will say, yeah, millions of Jews, died in World War II, and would do it again if we need to protect our culture. But sorry, just smashed my red sword against the table. There are all sorts of idiotic beliefs that people can have that just for me, it's just a tip off to I can just completely cut ties with such people.
I mean, well, let's talk about that. It's a very controversial subject, but you're pretty brave. I mean, there's these guys on YouTube who will go to Auschwitz and they'll point out that the Soviets built structures at Auschwitz that they even admit were built after the war. I mean, have you heard about that? What do you think?
The details don't matter, and this is what Jews don't get. They ask the wrong questions. They say, how can anyone deny the Holocaust? And that's not what it's about. First of all, none of the people who deny, quote unquote, the Holocaust, deny the Holocaust. They refer to themselves as revisionists, which means they, don't accept the conventional perspective. Second, the word Holocaust, after World War II, you said the Holocaust, that would have referred to all of Europe, where 55 million people died. So somehow Jews managed to seize that term and just make it pertain to Jewish suffering in World War II. But, it's understandable why Gentiles would, find it obnoxious. 55 million people died in World War II. I think the conventional account is somewhere between 4 to 6 million Jews died. But, to say that like Jewish suffering is the Holocaust, is quite obnoxious when there are, 50 million Gentiles, suffering and being slaughtered in the same continent. As far as like the concentration camps, when they were liberated, 4 out of the 5 people in them were not Jewish. So, we have this popular culture notion that the concentration camps were, primarily for Jews. Well, about 80% of the people in them were not Jewish. And so it's understandable, why Gentiles would find it obnoxious. So the thing is, the point of Holocaust revisionism, taking for granted the term Holocaust is an obnoxious, Jewish, arrogance that, it's Jewish suffering that's only deserves the term Holocaust. It has nothing to do with body counts and, gas chambers. What it is all about is tackling the Jewish use of the Holocaust to deny all sorts of things that need to be talked about and done. So Jewish organizations use the Holocaust to stop discussion of the problems of illegal immigration. Jewish organizations use the Holocaust to stop necessary discussions of basic human differences between, say, blacks, whites, Asians. The Holocaust is, just kind of a weapon that Jewish organizations and Jewish elites have used to shut down all sorts of necessary actions and discussions and just, matter of fact pointing out, noticing reality. So, that's what Holocaust revisionism is really about. It's like challenging the way that Jews have used the Holocaust to shut down all sorts of legitimate forms of discussion. So, these Holocaust revisionists have many different messages. They have a message aimed at the crowd with an IQ below 100, where they'll say, deny that there were ever gas chambers, not deny that millions of Jews were killed in World War II. But that's just aiming at like the low IQ crowd. The higher IQ crowd, they'll have a different message. Millions of Jews died in World War II, but that doesn't mean that anything we need to do today we can't do because of the Holocaust. Just think about how many Jewish organizations and Jews have made their living teaching the lessons of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is a very particular event in certain extreme circumstances. There aren't any like sweeping moral lessons to be made, and it's really, I don't know, it's kind of disgusting to merchandise and use the Holocaust to shut down all sorts of legitimate discussions and to turn it into a business and as a tool for just like beating the goyim over the head to try to weaken the Gentiles' racial, national, and religious identity because Holocaust. It's very understandable why some smart Gentiles object to the way that these Jewish elites and mainstream Jewish organizations have used the Holocaust as a battering ram to attack Western civilization.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Are you familiar with this guy? He's younger. His name's Eric Hunt.
No.
And basically, he went to Treblinka, and he shows this place, which they say was a gas chamber. And then he shows that there's glass windows in it, and so it's like, but you have no doubt about that. What about like the number? Because I was talking to Jim Fetzer, and he said that this number of 6 million Jews in peril had been used many years before. Do you have any doubt about that figure? Could it be lower than that?
Yeah, I think, look, I accept what is the scholarly consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And so the scholarly consensus seems to be somewhere around 4 million to possibly 6 million. So it seems from my reading, from my understanding, that the number of Jews who died in World War II is somewhere between 4 to 6 million. But I don't see, I have no moral problem, and I certainly don't think it should be illegal. I certainly don't think we should be jailing people who argue, no, it was just 3 million or 2 million or 1 million. I think, history it should be open for discussion, and it shouldn't be a crime to have different opinions on historical events.
Who talks the most about the Holocaust? The Orthodox, the conservative, or the Reform?
The non-Orthodox. I mean, certainly the Haredim, meaning all Hasidim, and the most religious branch of regular Orthodoxy, does not select the Holocaust out as a different event on a different scale from other forms of Jewish suffering. But for everyone else, particularly secular Jews, Reform Jews, and conservative Jews, like the Holocaust is like the one thing that unites them. Pretty much everything else they disagree on. They disagree about God, they disagree about Torah, they disagree about Israel. So the one thing that unites Jews is their fear of the Holocaust. And so when you put on Holocaust-themed events, Jews show up. You put up an event talking about God or talking about Torah or talking about Israel, non-Orthodox Jews will have a lot of different arguments about that. But the Holocaust has been the most uniting thing for American Jews.
Let's talk Talmud. So as I told you, I'm a big YouTube person, and I just love conspiracy videos. So I've seen a lot of pretty anti-Semitic videos. Like there's a really long one called Synagogue of Satan by some guy named A.C. Carrington. I'm not sure if you've seen it.
No.
And it's clear the guy is really anti-Jewish, but I can judge things for myself, so I'll watch anything if I find it interesting. But the thing I wanted to ask you is about he purports to quote the Talmud at certain points. And there's two quotes that stand out to me. One is apparently if a goy falls into a crevice, a Jew cannot give him a ladder. Is that true?
I'm not sure, but there are certainly things like that in the Talmud. So, the Talmud is a product of a particular time. People, it may be the product of a discussion, say, shortly after the destruction of the temple, or, when Jews were feeling particularly oppressed and particularly bitter against non-Jews. So there are certainly horrifying parts of the Talmud when you read it today. And I don't think we should expect that any closely identifying group is going to be terribly altruistic towards outsiders. The stronger your group identity, whether it's as Jewish or as white or as black or Muslim or Christian, the less likely you are to have a positive view of outsiders. So, the Talmud is the product of people with very strong in-group identity. And so any literature that is produced by people with a very strong in-group identity is going to tend towards a skeptical, hostile, distrustful, and negative view of outsiders. So I don't think the Talmud is any different than any other literature produced in that respect, produced by people with a very strong in-group identity.
And how would, your Orthodox rabbi, what would he say about that, a quote like that? Would he say, well,
Well, it would depend. He probably wouldn't, waste time debating with someone who hated Jews, but if a Jew came to him with that question, then they'd sit down. Okay, so he'd sit down, okay, what's the chapter and verse, and let's look at the context. So, for instance, there is a Jewish law about you shouldn't break the Sabbath to save the life of a non-Jew, but that is traditionally interpreted as, we don't observe that anymore. You certainly do pick up the phone. You certainly do, violate the Sabbath to save the life of a non-Jew. But because, one rabbi in one situation, says that law, it's there in the Jewish tradition. And then you have to see other rabbis interpret it and apply it to changing circumstances.
Give me a very brief sketch of the Talmud, and when did it end? When was the last writing in the Talmud?
The final editing was by year 500 of the Common Era. So before there was ever the Bible, there was an oral tradition, and then the oral tradition was written down into what became the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and eventually the whole Hebrew Bible. And so as there was an oral tradition that got written down into the Hebrew Bible. Not all of it was written into the Hebrew Bible. Some of it was just kept orally over the generations and written down, and that formed the Mishnah. The Mishnah reached its final form in year 200 of the Common Era, so about 170 years after the death of Jesus. And then the Talmud explicitly refers to the 300 years after the final closing of the Mishnah in year 200 of the Common Era. So the Talmud of the 300 years of rabbinic commentary on the Mishnah, the oral Torah. And then as soon as the Talmud closes in year 500 of the Common Era, then you immediately have, commentators, rabbis from the 6th century, 7th century, commenting on the Talmud. And then their commentaries get written onto the side of the Talmudic text. And then later, rabbis comment on those commentaries, and so that's how the stream of Judaism has flowed throughout time.
How many pages?
It's about 6,000 folio pages, so I think that's two-sided pages. So if you study a blot, which means 2 pages referring to one side and then the other. So we would talk in Talmud terms, that's just 1 page, but it's 2 sides of 1 page. So if you study 2 sides of 1 page every day. It will take you 6.5 years to go through the entire Talmud.
Have you read it all?
Largely. I've been in Daf Yomi. That's where you study a page of Talmud a day, on and off for 15 years.
And if I and is it good? Is it of value?
It depends on your personality, and some people will take to it and some people won't. For instance, in Daf Yomi right now, we're doing the tractate Sota, which is the ritual that you perform when a woman is suspected of adultery. And I think most people would find this interesting, and certainly most Jews would find it interesting. But other tractates, such as a Reuven, which is about the particulars of setting up an eruv, which is like a little string that denominates a private area so that you can carry on the Sabbath. That's very dry stuff. So much of it would be not very easily accessible, but then there are also a lot of parts of it that are just amazing stories and that is accessible. So, overall, generally speaking, you just open up a volume of the Talmud, even if it's translated, even if it's the Art Scroll or the Steinsaltz translation, you're going to be totally lost and bored and turned off. But some small bits of it are immediately accessible.
So if God came to you, Luke Ford, and said, Luke, I want to publish the Talmud, but I want a wide audience, will you edit it? And you would come back to God and say, "Oh, I think we need to shave it down to what? How many pages?"
Well, if God came to me and said that, I would dial 911 and check myself into a mental institution.
I think you should write a book, The Best of the Talmud, maybe. I would read it for sure.
I remember I was on this date, and I was trying to explain to this very sexy, very spunky, very outspoken Persian Jewess about why I decided to write my first book on the porn industry. And so I gave my long-winded explanation, and she summed it up by saying, "Oh, so God called you to go write a book on the porn industry."
One last Talmud question, which is, I hear that apparently that a rabbi debates God in the Talmud and beats God, and God admits he lost the debate. Is this true?
Yeah, that's a very famous story. So there are a lot of, wild stories in the Talmud. I mean, rabbis sometimes compare their penis sizes.
Really?
Yeah, there's like, there's this one story, if a woman is anally raped by a pack of dogs, can she still marry the high priest? There's a lot of, very extreme, very wild stories in the Talmud. I love it, but it's understandable why, other people would be thoroughly repelled by that sort of discussion.
I think you should write The Best of the Talmud book. By the way, what did God lose the debate about? Do you remember?
Is some very intricate thing about whether or not a stove was kosher.
Wow. And what does the Talmud say about race in general? Anything?
Well, not just the Talmud, but pretty much the entire Jewish tradition portrays, being pale and white as a good thing and being dark as an ugly thing.
Okay. So let's get into your entry in. You decided you're going to write a book about porn. So it wasn't in the cards to become what Wikipedia describes you as being, which was a gossip columnist for the porn industry. That was not the plan at all?
No, I was writing, an academic history of the porn industry. And even though I do not have a PhD, my father has 2 PhDs. I grew up on college campuses. I've always been very well read in academic literature. So I was applying, those tools that I inherited to writing about the porn industry. And then I developed, in the course of that, thousands of pages of notes. And people told me, if you just put them online and put some ads around them, you'll be able to make a living. You'll make much more money than from writing a book. And so I found that was true. And then I quickly found that people were more interested in porn gossip than they were in, thoughtful academic essays on the pornography industry. So I kind of adapted, and from about the fall of 1997 until basically the fall of 2007, I was able to make my living writing about the porn industry. I never really economically exploited it because I always thought that making money off the porn industry was absolutely disgusting. So I always just kind of like took the minimum amount that I needed to survive. And but at least it gave me the opportunity to devote myself full time to writing.
So I've been looking into your father. I don't know if you kept in contact. One, what was his reaction to you becoming a Jew, and what was his reaction to, oh yeah, by the way, I'm Jewish now, and I'm writing about pornography. What was his response?
Oh, you're so proud. I'm kidding. When I told him I converted to Judaism, I was living at home at the time, and he looked up from his book and he said, well, there's certainly not like the Seventh-day Adventists out there proselytizing, because he knew how difficult it had been for me to get to my conversion. I'm sure he found it embarrassing, but it wasn't 1/1000th of the embarrassment of having a son who devoted himself to chronicling the porn industry. That was like the shame of all shames.
And did he try to, did he try to shame you, or was he just...
My parents weren't happy about it, but remember I was in my late 20s by this time, so
Yeah.
I was living far away from home. There was nothing they could do.
Did he read your work?
I doubt it.
So you never got an email like, read your interview with Nina Hartley, Luke. While I don't agree with it, I think your writing was good.
No. I got emails along the line of, nobody who knew you as a kid could imagine the filth and degradation that you're trafficking in now. It's a very deep illness, sickness, perversion, and, please turn to God.
Wow. That must have been tough, I imagine.
Yeah, it wasn't easy to realize how much shame I was causing my family.
Yeah, you have, looking at your career, you have amazing persistence. Most other people after that first time in the synagogue probably would have stepped back, but you didn't. Is this just something you've had your entire life?
Yeah, I do have amazing persistence in some things. So, some things I just get hooked in and, I just dedicate myself. For instance, I listened to Dennis Prager's show, pretty much every day until about a year ago, maybe about 2 years ago. So for about 30 years, I was listening to Dennis Prager, and I can assure you that much of that time I was kind of, sick to death of him. But I kind of made a, commitment to kind of follow him, track him, write about him. I wanted to, fully understand him and be up to date with him. And, you can only make a limited number of commitments in your life and make them count. So there are some things that I committed to and then just, stuck with them through, good times and bad.
Yeah, it's funny. I see similarities between you and I. I also listen. I'm not as devoted as you were, Prager, but I listen to Alex Jones a lot just because I find him entertaining at the very least. So I get the sense that when you were just writing a book, you're researching. So I imagine you were tracking down John Holmes's wife and going to her house and interviewing her. Is that right?
Laurie Holmes, she was never a big fan of mine. She sued me for libel for writing that she worked as a prostitute, and I won that lawsuit. There are plenty of people who testify that she'd worked as a prostitute. I interviewed hundreds of people in the porn industry.
So you're going around and you're meeting people who were in the porn industry, and how old were most of them?
Well, they varied from, 18 to 70. So I interviewed a lot of people.
And I can imagine that must have been striking if you ever went from an interview with an ex-porn star actress now in her 50s, and then you went to a porn set and met a version of her 30 years younger. Did that ever happen? And what did you think when that did happen?
Well, it was all just variations on swimming in a sewer. So, you can find, this particular bit of effluence is, it's got this smell, but, it was all just a sewer. So it was just all different varieties of sewage. So, when I was like chronicling the sewer, I would pay attention to distinctions and differences, but once I climbed out of the sewer, I washed it off and never looked back. I haven't stayed in touch with anyone from the porn industry. I don't read about the porn industry. I've been pretty much porn free for about 8 years, and it's very rare that I even think about the porn industry. But for about 10 years or so, I did swim in that sewer and chronicled what I learned.
So these are the I guess you're one of the original bloggers, is that correct?
Yeah, I guess. Certainly one of the originals to make a living at blogging. I don't know if there's anyone who was able to make a living from blogging earlier than I did. So from about September of 1997, I was making my living from blogging.
So you really belong in the Computer History Museum, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I've also been sued 5 times for libel, so I'm going to assume that's more than any other blogger.
Yeah, and what was the internet like in the early days compared to today?
I started getting on a friend's computer regularly in December of 1996, and I kind of used it to check out various facets of my book on the history of sex and film. I bought my first real computer on July 3rd, 1997, and within an hour, I had a web page up. I took it home, I plugged it in, and I went on, used my AOL pages and, put up a page, and very quickly was getting hundreds of hits.